Man, come on. I got to thinking about the Sermon on the Mount, and it occurred to me that the Sermon on the Mount and the teachings of Jesus, if you want great relationship advice, and everybody's looking for relationship advice, read the Sermon on the Mount. Read the teachings of Jesus. Put them into practice and see if they don't work, because they really do. Last week we talked about one relationship issue, and that has to do with anger and the importance of reconciliation. And some of the responses that I heard after the lesson were very encouraging to me. One lady said after 30 years of not speaking to my brother, we were finally reconciled. That's good news. Another man said, I just realized a couple of years ago that I have spent most of my life being angry, and I don't even know why. But Jesus teaches us that we can overcome anger. Another person said, what causes this? What causes anger? And she answered her own question when she said, basically, isn't it selfishness? Yeah, I think that has a lot to do with it. I got a lot of interesting responses to today's title, so I need to do my best to explain what we're talking about, because God made sex really good. And that is a scriptural statement. God is the creator of all good things. And the Bible teaches us that He has created in such a way for our enjoyment. But the Bible also teaches us that God has shown us how sexual expressions need to take place. And it's in the marriage relationship between a husband and a wife. Let's review for just a moment. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says in the last few verses in chapter 7, this stuff is doable. Whoever hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house upon a rock. We're trying to put these words into practice. In the first 12 verses of Matthew chapter 5, Jesus tells us, you're blessed, you're loved. All kinds of people are blessed and loved. And then Jesus makes this declaration, you are salt and you are light, now act like it. And then Jesus begins an interesting section when he says, don't think that I have come to abolish the law and the prophets. I've not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. Law is good if we understand the proper meaning of law. And so Jesus sets out to give us a perfect interpretation, a perfect understanding of law by providing 6 applications of law. And the first one was the one we talked about last week in Matthew chapter 5, verses 21 through 26. The danger of anger, the danger of murderous thoughts, the danger of ugly language, raka, you fool, using expressions like idiot, stupid, moron, put-downs and sarcasm and contemptuous speech. Jesus says that's dangerous. That is going to break relationships. And it begins in the heart. Jesus is always concerned about the heart. And so he says it's more important for us to restore relationship with others than it is for us to go to worship. If you're on your way to offer your sacrifice there at the temple, Jesus says, and you remember that your brother has something against you, leave your sacrifice there and go be reconciled to your brother. Reconciliation, restoration of relationship is always more important than worship. And then we're able to worship. And here in Matthew chapter 5, verses 27 through 32, Jesus reveals the right way to understand human sexuality. He's talking about deep faithfulness and commitment in the marriage relationship. And it starts from the inside, and it changes our perspective in terms of how we view people. And yes, God made sex really good. The Bible teaches us this. From creation, when he created Adam and Eve, he created them male and female. And then in the Song of Songs or the Song of Solomon, it expresses the beautiful physical relationship between a husband and a wife, and God puts his stamp of approval on it. And then as you move into the pages of the New Testament, these really, really smart guys come up to Jesus and they ask him, is it okay to divorce your wife for any and every cause? And Jesus says to them basically, haven't you read the Bible? Haven't you read God's plan from creation? A man will leave his mother and his father and be joined to his wife, and they will be one flesh. God wants that to take place. In God's mind, according to God's word, yes, sex is really good. In 1 Corinthians chapter 7, Paul deals with a group of Christians that are going through a lot of stuff. A lot of them are very immature. And he gives them some practical advice regarding their marriage relationship. And again, God puts his stamp of approval on it. And in Ephesians chapter 5, Paul says, a marriage relationship between husband and wife is similar to the relationship between Christ and his church. Those are all beautiful pictures of what God intended in terms of human sexuality. Let's talk about a man named Augustine and his struggle for just a few moments, a little bit of history here. Augustine, it's hard to imagine people living in the 5th century. That's a long time ago. And it may come as a shock to you that a guy by the name of Augustine, or Augustine, we'll call him Augustine, he had a powerful voice in early Christianity, and that voice continued to echo down through the centuries. He lived in a place called Hippo. I love that name. It was in northern Africa, part of Algeria now. It was a place of Christian growth, and he was referred to as the Bishop of Hippo. He was born in 430 A.D., and he began his work about that time. But he struggled with something that we struggle with, and that was sexual desire and sexual temptation. He was an interesting person because he converted to Jesus later in life as an adult, and when he became a follower of Jesus, he brought a lot of his sexual immorality and baggage with him. And when he became a Christian, he began to equate sex with sin and make them one and the same thing. And that basic theology, or that basic teaching, has affected the church for centuries. And that's a tragedy. That's sad. Because on that point, Augustine got it completely wrong. Because the Bible teaches us that sex and sin are far from the same thing. The Bible teaches that sex can be practiced in a sinful, immoral way, but it also shows us that sex can be one of the basic building blocks of our humanity. From the story of creation all the way to the Song of Songs, the Bible puts its stamp of approval on human sexuality, and God declares it good. And in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus tells us that sexuality can and often does go wrong. It went wrong 2,000 years ago, and it continues to go badly wrong today in our culture and in our world. All you have to do is Google the word infidelity, and you'll find a whole bunch of statistics that really will rock your world. I read one that said, guess what the percentage is of men who say they would have extramarital affair if they knew they could get away with it. Any guesses? 83%. Well, that's pretty close. It was 74%. What about women? He says it's higher. It was 68%. Now, I don't know about you, but that's crazy to me. There was another article in the Wall Street Journal that was titled "The Young and the Restless," talking about how this isn't getting better, it's actually getting worse. And a lot of reasons, a lot of excuses, a lot of factors involved, the internet, chat rooms, all sorts of other things. But God shows us what he wants for our lives. And so Jesus contrasts a religious cultural view with his interpretation of the law. He says, you've heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. That's one of the 10 commandments. We need to follow that. The scribes and the Pharisees, they said, that's all, the farther you need to go. Anything else is okay. Jesus says, no, it's not okay. He says, but I say to you, whoever looks at a woman lustfully in his heart has already committed adultery. Jesus places the emphasis on the heart once again. It's a transformation from the inside out that needs to take place. And so you read these words of Jesus and you ask yourself, is there anybody in the world who's not an adulterer? Remember about 40 years ago, President Jimmy Carter famously said, I've looked on many women with lust. I've committed adultery in my heart many times. God knows I will do this and forgives me. Some asked, was he crazy, or was he simply telling the truth and pointing out Jesus has a radical way to express purity and the way we need to express purity? Jesus talks about sex in profound ways. He works out of this rich background of the Old Testament, of the Jewish way of looking at things. And the problem is we've been influenced too often by the Greek notion of what God wants. The Greeks kind of had this idea that, not all the time, but part of their philosophy was the body itself, flesh itself, it's just evil, so, that's just bad. The Bible doesn't teach that. The Bible shows us in the creation account that when God created, he said, it is good. And so, from this Jewish background, Jesus pronounces these words. Clyde Edgerton wrote a book called Killer Diller, interesting title. It tells the story of a young man who was an ex-convict, and he became a believer. And after he got out of jail, he went to a Christian college. He was converted by an older lady. And he went to a Christian college, and he began to study the Bible, and he read the Song of Solomon. And he went to visit this elderly lady, and he said to her, have you read the Song of Solomon? It is hot. It really sizzles. And she said, no, I don't think so. He said, no, really, it does. And she said, no, I think that book is about Christ and the church. He just kind of looked at her and asked, have you read the book? I remember many years ago, it was about 25, 30 years ago, I was scheduled to teach a Wednesday night Bible class for some teenagers. And I was young, newlywed, and I got to class. I had my outline ready, and had a subject I was going to teach on, and I noticed there weren't any boys in the class. 8 girls, and I was the only guy there. And then I realized they were up to something. They wanted to see how many shades of red I could turn. And so I said, okay, here's what we're going to study. And I said, let's turn to this book in the Bible. And one of them raised her hand, and they had planned this all out. And she said, well, Dale, we think we should read the Song of Solomon tonight. What do you do with that? I said, okay, I really think that's a good idea. You should read the Song of Solomon when you get married with your husband. And they sort of giggled, but one little girl didn't giggle. She said, I am never going to get married. And I got to thinking about it. And if you knew her background, you would understand why she would say, I will never get married. Her father was abusive to her mother and the children. He chased around. He was unfaithful. And eventually he just abandoned the family. And so she had a pretty bad impression of marriage. All she had ever seen was the ugliness of the way one human being treated other human beings. And so she said, I will never get married. And I thought, here's a teaching moment. How do I explain to this young lady and to the other young ladies here God's idea of marriage? And so I encouraged the girls to turn to Ephesians chapter 5, and we spent a little bit of time looking at Ephesians 5:21 to the end of the chapter and emphasizing the verse that says, husbands, love your wives as Christ loves the church. And we talked about how Christ loves the church and how Christ died for the church and gave himself for the church and protects the church and loves the church and cherishes the church and provides for the church. And we looked at 1 Corinthians 13 and the definition of God's idea of love there. And I asked the question, what if there's a man out there who's like this husband that the Bible's talking about in Ephesians 5? She had a change of heart. She went to a Christian college, and last I heard, she married a guy like that. That's God's idea of human sexuality. Jesus is concerned about the way we view and value people, about relationships. Remember, the righteousness of Jesus is from the inside out. It's from the heart. And I'm not sure, but I really don't think the way to help people is to nag them. I don't think it does any good to say, stop lusting. Shout it out. It's kind of like saying, stop thinking about a pink elephant. Right now, whatever you do, don't imagine that there's a pink elephant right here or pink elephants all over this room. Don't think about a pink elephant. I'm thinking about a pink elephant. So what we need to do, and Jesus teaches us this, is we need to change our perspective. We need to have a change of heart and a change of mind and change our attitude. So what does Jesus mean by lust? We know that the natural sexual relations in the committed husband-wife marriage are good and that they are God-given. So he's not condemning his creation. He's not saying that sexual desires are wrong. In fact, when you read the Old Testament, you find lots of places where the Bible even says so-and-so was a beautiful woman. So it's not wrong to appreciate God's creation. For example, in Genesis chapter 12, verse 14, the Bible describes Sarah as a very beautiful woman. In Genesis 24, verse 16, it says Rebekah was very beautiful. In Genesis 29, it says Rachel was lovely in form and beautiful. Beautiful women all over the Bible, okay? And there's handsome men all over the Bible. Because it describes Joseph, I believe it's Genesis 37, but back in Genesis 39, it says Joseph was well-built and handsome. Translated, he was buffed. Okay? He was a good-looking dude, and the Bible just makes it clear. Just says it straight out and doesn't apologize for it. And then it says about David, he was ruddy with a fine appearance and handsome features. Now, David's son Absalom, he was really good-looking. He was over-the-top good-looking, even though he was a narcissist. He was self-absorbed. He was deceptive. He was not a good guy. All right? But listen to the description that the Bible gives regarding Absalom. In all Israel, there was not a man so highly praised for his handsome appearance as Absalom. From the top of his head to the sole of his foot, there was no blemish in him. Whenever he cut the hair of his head, he used to cut his hair once a year because it became so too heavy for him. He would weigh it, and its weight was 200 shekels. That means 5 pounds of hair. Now question, who in the world weighs their hair after they cut it? That's what I mean when I said he's self-absorbed. He was a narcissist. So the Bible clearly shows us that it's perfectly okay to appreciate God's wonderful creation. So what is lust? Dallas Willard describes it this way. He says, Jesus says simply that those who look upon a woman for the purpose of lusting for her, using her visual presence as a means of savoring the fantasized act, has thereby committed adultery with her in his heart. When he continues to linger on and on and on and makes plans as to how he might get the job done. Now, there's a great book that we give to young couples, young men. It's called Hedges, Loving Your Marriage Enough to Protect It, written by a guy by the name of Jerry Jenkins. You can watch his video online for free. You don't have to buy anything. You can buy the book, and it's only about $10, or if you're getting married, we'll get you a copy. Anyway, in this book, he talks about the need to love your marriage enough to put up those protections to prevent this kind of lust that Jesus is talking about. Randy Harris said the deep sin of lust and porn is that you use another person as simply an object of your desires. It is the ultimate selfish act. It makes that person an object and nothing more. The problem with lust is this: it views people as an object to satisfy your own selfish desires. It ignores the value and the worth of another human being. And that's why Jesus gives us this teaching. And he says something similar in the next couple of verses, in chapter 5, verses 31 and 32, where the common thinking, he's working out of the same framework, and the common thinking of that day was, guys, if you're tired of her, give her a certificate of divorce, do the paperwork right, and then you can send her packing, and you can get a younger, And it's the same kind of thing, using another human being instead of loving that human being. Now, there's a guy, he says that when you get a new car, you should take a hammer. Seriously. You should take a hammer and put the first dent in the car. And then you won't be afraid to park real close to the door of your favorite department store. Because, you already got the dent in your car. His point is this: things are to be used, not loved. People are to be loved and not used. And that's what Jesus is teaching us in these verses in Matthew chapter 5. Imagine a world where there's this deep faithfulness in the marriage relationship. Imagine a world where we put that using other people aside as objects, where we really love people with compassion and integrity for who they are, not as objects. How is it that one of the greatest gifts that God has given us from his love, human sexuality, has gone so wrong? And we've managed to sexualize just about everything in our culture. I mean, even little children. Where did that come from? You see, what we do is we take something that God has created to be enjoyed in the right way, in his way, and we just make a big mess out of it. And we ruin lives as a result. And the problem is we need to change the heart. This is from the inside out. And Jesus says that this stuff is so serious. This is so serious that he uses this hyperbolic language. He says, if your right eye offends you, gouge it out. If your right hand is causing you to sin, cut it off. Now, I don't believe Jesus is telling us that we need to do that literally, but what he's saying is, this is so serious, you need to be careful about the input that you're receiving. This is so serious that you need to be careful about what you expose yourself to. This is so serious because people are to be loved and not used as our objects of our own gratification. Ed Dobson tells a story in his book, A Year Living Like Jesus, about a young man who approached him after he had given a lecture at a Christian university. And he had talked about some of these things that we've talked about this morning. And this young man came up to him and he pointed to his right eye. He had literally gouged out his eye. And he said, why? He said, because that's what Jesus told me to do. But then he said this, which reveals that that wasn't the right approach. He said, but you know what? I still have another eye, and I can lust with that. The problem is the heart. The heart has to change, and then the rest will change as well. What's at the heart of most sexual sin, whether it's porn or sexual immorality, is that we use the other person as a means of our gratification instead of caring about the other person as a person. The focus of sexual sin is always selfishness. And Jesus calls us to overcome selfishness by looking to him and his word. Randy Harris, in his book, Living Jesus, shares that he works with students 18 to 22 years of age. He tries to help them with this, and he has some input that I think I need to share with you. Number one, he says, if you want to cut something off, cut off the input of pornography and tempting situations. Number two, you need to get a support community, a group of people who will encourage you and help you to be accountable. Number three, you have to trust God to remake your heart. God can do it. You know, a lot of times we say to ourselves, oh, I don't think that person will ever change. If that was true, why do we have groups like Alcoholics Anonymous? Why do we have groups for people that are struggling with drug addiction? Because people can change. We can choose to change. But we need accountability. We need community. We need love. We need encouragement. We need support. And then he says, change the way you think. Start thinking about good things, pure things, like Paul talks about in Philippians chapter 4. And learn to express love the way God intended, not simply as a way of fulfilling your own selfish needs and desires. I think those are pretty good words. I think those are very helpful words. I think the words of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount really are the best relationship counsel we can possibly receive. Someone called me the other day and just had an argument with my spouse. And it was a sad conversation. And I said, well, you know, we all mess up. And there comes a time when we need to do that reconciliation, restoration thing. Tell your spouse you're sorry. There are things we can do in our relationships to improve them. But there's only one person I can change in life. And that's me. Yeah. I can't fix you. Jesus can't fix you unless you allow him to fix you. Right? He provides all the information. He gives us the instructions. He shows us what healthy relationships look like. But it's up to each one of us to choose his way of living. If you're ready to make that choice today, we want to encourage you to do that as together we stand and sing.